realize your full poker potential. You'll receive instant access to videos tailored to your current skill set, as well as coaching from some of today's biggest winners. We are adding new coaching video to our video library every day. Take a look at Short Insight into one of our video.
This go a little bit. I think it's a little bit more engaging when we get a look at your guys' hands too. So we start here with Ace-8 of spades. Which I think we know what's going to happen here. Is Alexi's going to call, and he does. And now we catch 8 in this situation, and the deuce comes out. And Alexi bets 75% of pot here, which I think it's interesting because if we're going to look at the GTO strategy in this spot, what we're going to see is this player is going to have checked back a whole bunch of interesting hands. And so this should be an okay bet at this point in time. One of the things that seems to be consistent in these spots is to trend a little bit smaller in sizings. So betting here at 3 big blinds rather than 3.5 is what Pio seems to prefer. Additionally, because the player's a little bit trickier in this spot, we'll see this being more mixed than maybe we would in practice. If we break this down from a traditional standpoint against, I'm going to assume he's a winning tournament reg. I expect his check back range here to be comprised primarily of ace highs, 8x, 7x's, and then some few 9x's. And because we have roughly 80-85% equity against his range, making a bet here makes a lot of sense. And so we want to use a smaller sizing because it turns out that 85% equity, betting half pot or a little bit less ends up maximizing our value. And we aren't really very concerned about getting raised in this situation because the average player doesn't raise very frequently here. So we're not going to be very concerned about getting bluff raised. So essentially our plan is to bet fold at something about half pot. Now it turns out that that's a little bit you can exploit that of course by bluff raising, but in general the player pool doesn't do it very often. And then on the river in this situation, what we're going to do is we'll generally either place a small bet or we'll check depending on the river card. And the only card that we would probably choose a bigger bet size on would be an 8, a 9, or an ace. Now, I think if we look at this from a GTO perspective, we're going to see a much more balanced strategy here because of the expectation of slow plays in this situation. So if we go ahead and we pull... go ahead and we pull this board texture. I don't quite have the exact board texture, but I have an awfully similar one. And then we'll put the 2 of spades out. So we can see here that Pio likes a mixed strategy here with ace-7. And he likes the smaller sizing here. In general, Pio seems to prefer smaller sizings, donk sizings here than you see in practice. I think I need a little bit more research to say that that's probably what we want to do, because one of the reasons this is happening, as I mentioned previously, is we've got a really good mix coming to the turn. And if we actually start looking at his checking ranges, he now has things like kings and queens and jacks that's betting. And I think a lot of players in practice just don't have them at the same frequency. So it's a little bit, so this sizing's getting artificially pressed down. That being said, this happens enough in this situation that I feel comfortable thinking that the smaller sizing here is probably better. Maybe by a little bit, maybe by a lot, but it's certainly preferred here very, very frequently. So one of the things I might do here, Alexi, is bet a little bit smaller. And then on the 5, you go ahead and bet half pot again. I think this is probably the spot that's going to get a lot more marginal because the average player doesn't pay off in these situations all the time with sixes and sevens, which means that betting ace-8 here gets a lot more marginal and ultimately depends a lot on the number of slow plays he has. And what we'll see from a GTO perspective, I'm hoping, and I think the 6 is probably the closest here. Is that we usually prefer a check in this situation because we don't expect to get called by worse here. So if we bet 75% on the turn and then we bet half pot here on the river, even though he's folding 24% of the time and bluff raising us, we still don't have a profitable bet with something like ace-7. You can look here and it's about a quarter big blind worse than checking. And I think we can reason that out in game, because basically whenever his slow plays, he's always going to call 9x or better. Occasionally he's going to have hands like ace-3 that end up calling or raising the river. Occasionally he's going to have 5s. Essentially, what we need to do here is we need to get called by half the time, more than half the time, by worse than ace-8. It's possible against certain player types that will happen, but it's not probable, and I think against most pros you probably won't. That being said, you still win this pot 65% of the time. You end up winning the pot by check back rather than by betting. So we can go ahead and take a look at our equity in this situation, and it seems to think that ace-7 here has 52. Realistically, it's probably closer to 60 because the number of slow plays in the GTO ranges are going to be a lot greater than what we see in practice. It's a really good hand. I like that hand a lot. So he does call with ace-4. I don't know if that validates or invalidates the play. We do expect to get called by worse here occasionally. In fact, we would get called by worse here about a quarter of the time at equilibrium. So if we bet half pot, he has to call 2/3 of the time. We have 50% equity. That means that he actually calls worse here a quarter of the time. In general, I favor the more passive line of checking the river. And I apparently didn't select all hands, so we'll...
Ready to start crushing? Join now.